In this topic, we're going to discuss the transport of oxygen at high altitude. Now, in the last few topics, we've discussed how oxygen is transported under normal circumstances. There are circumstances where the adaptations have to be made to ensure efficient transport of oxygen. So one example is high altitude. Now, in this topic, we're going to discuss what happens to the partial pressure of oxygen with increasing altitude, what is altitude sickness, and then finally, what is acclimatization? You know that you have to be careful if you want to go climbing high mountains. Now, the popular misconception is that the oxygen is less at high altitude. So this is not true. The proportion of oxygen is still the same, 21%. What changes at high altitude is the air pressure. This decreases as we ascend from sea level. So in other words, the higher you go, the less air above you is weighing down on your body. So as a result, the air pressure on top of, say, Mount Everest is less than 1/3 that at sea level. Such low pressures make breathing and the loading of hemoglobin with oxygen difficult. So let's have a look at this example. If you go 6,500 meters above sea level, the atmospheric pressure decreases to about 50 kilopascals. Now, since the oxygen partial pressure is 21% of this, the oxygen partial pressure will be 10 kilopascals. So 20 over 100 times 50 is about 10 kilopascals. So as you go higher up, for example, to 8,500 meters, the atmospheric pressure is about 31.9 kilopascals. So the oxygen partial pressure is 6.7 kilopascals. So notice how the oxygen partial pressure has gone from 21 kilopascals at sea level down to 6.7 kilopascals at 8,500 meters above sea level. Here's a table to demonstrate that the higher you go, so the partial pressure of oxygen decreases in both the air and the lungs. What you need to look at is the percentage of saturation of the hemoglobin. So notice how the partial pressure of hemoglobin has gone from 95% at sea level all the way down to 30 to 40% on the top of Mount Everest. Sorry, that's the percentage saturation of hemoglobin. We thus say at high altitudes, there's a reduced oxygen carrying capacity due to the low partial pressure of oxygen in the air. So there's a reduced oxygen carrying capacity due to the low partial pressure of oxygen in the air. So what is altitude sickness? Now, more than half the people trekking to about 5,000 meters will experience altitude-related illness. So this is also called acute mountain sickness. So the symptoms include headaches and dizziness, nausea and vomiting, weakness due to low oxygen, increased breathing rate, so you have less carbon dioxide to stimulate breathing, and this can lead to fluid in the brain and lungs. So what is acclimatization? Sudden exposure to the reduced pressure at high altitude could result in death within 10 minutes. This is because if hemoglobin cannot be loaded with oxygen, the level of oxygen in the blood and tissue falls, resulting in a condition called hypoxia. However, if you go up a mountain slowly, for example, over many weeks, the body can adjust by trying to maximize, in other ways, the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissues. So this process is called acclimatization. So one way of acclimatizing is for the number of red blood cells in circulation to increase. Due to the reduced atmospheric pressure at high altitude, hemoglobin cannot be fully loaded with oxygen. So the increase in the number of red blood cells compensates for this and increases the rate of oxygen transport from the lungs and the tissue. So what is acclimatization? Well, acclimatization is complete when there is sustained increased ventilation, increase in oxygen carrying capacity of blood due to an increase in red blood cells, increased cardiac output. Now, people who live at high altitudes tend to have broader chests, larger hearts, and more hemoglobin. Right, in summary, what happens to the partial pressure of oxygen with increasing altitude? Well, as the altitude increases, so the partial pressure of oxygen in the air decreases. Remember that this is not due to less oxygen in the air, but due to the lower pressure of the atmospheric pressure of the air. What is altitude sickness? So altitude sickness has many symptoms. Can you remember them? Well, these include headaches, dizziness, weakness, increased breathing rate, and fluid in the brain and lungs. And then finally, what is acclimatization? This is when you sustain an increase in ventilation, more red blood cells are made, so there's an increased oxygen carrying capacity of the blood, and you also have an increase in the cardiac output. And that concludes our lesson. The end.